The final layer of the integument is the deepest layer of the dermis, called the reticular layer. It's the reticular layer that's the thicker layer of the dermis. It continues downwards deeper from the papillary layer and extends all the way down to the bottom of the integument. Remember, just below the reticular layer will be the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous tissue. Now, like the papillary layer, the reticular layer is made out of connective tissue proper, but this is dense, irregular connective tissue proper. If you recall from our discussion of connective tissue, this type of connective tissue proper has a very distinct appearance. You're going to see bundles of collagen fibers, and they're all going to be oriented in different directions, giving it sort of a disheveled appearance, an unorganized appearance. Now, in the reticular layer, you will also find all those accessory structures that we talked about. Hair follicles will be located here, sebaceous glands, the two different kinds of sweat glands, the eccrine and the apocrine. There'll be nerves in the reticular layer and blood vessels. On this slide, you're looking at an image under the light microscope of the integument. This upper, darker layer is the epidermis. So the stratum basale would be right here at the very bottom of that dark purple layer, and the rest of the epidermis would be upwards. This is the stratum corneum, that layer of flattened, dead cells. Everything down here in the lighter pink color, this is dermis. Now I like this image because I think on this image you can tell the difference between the upper papillary layer and the lower reticular layer. See how the papillary layer looks a little more organized? It's light pink, but it just looks more organized compared to what lies below it, which looks very disorganized. All of this that you're looking at in the reticular layer, this is bundles of collagen fibers, and they're all oriented in different directions, so it gives it this very unorganized look. On this slide, we're looking at a drawing of the reticular layer and the rest of the integument, as well as some of the hypodermis down below the integument. If you start over here on the right, everything in this sort of brownish orange color, this up and upwards is epidermis. Everything down here represents dermis in the light pink color. You can see the blood vessels lying deep in the reticular layer. Everything below that would be subcutaneous tissue. Now notice these accessory structures. There's a hair follicle with a hair growing out of it. There's a very small little yellow gland right here. That's a representation of a sebaceous gland or an oil gland, and it's secreting its oil right into the hair follicle. This blue sort of twisted structure, this is an apocrine sweat gland. So it's going to secrete its sort of thick and bad smelling sweat right into the hair follicle. Over here we can see another blue colored sweat gland, but this one is secreting its sweat right onto the surface of the skin. This is an eccrine sweat gland. It's secreting that much more watery sweat, the sweat that doesn't tend to smell quite as bad. Now look at the image over on the left-hand side. This has had a little bit of a higher magnification. I want you to pay attention here to the hair follicle because there's some anatomy here that we need to know as well. The hair itself that grows out of the follicle, we talk about that as being the hair shaft. Now you'll notice there's some vocabulary associated with hair shafts. Don't worry about that vocabulary. Just know that the hair itself is referred to as a hair shaft. But let's take a look at the follicle. At the very bottom is what's called the hair papilla or papillae, and this is where the hair grows from. The sort of rounded out, extended area at the bottom of the hair follicle, this is referred to as the bulb of the hair follicle. You can also see that there are layers of tissue around the growing hair. There's what's referred to as the inner and the outer root sheath. The inner is shown in green. The outer is shown in this tan color. So next to this hair follicle and this hair that's growing out of it, you can see a gland. This is the sebaceous gland, or the oil-producing gland, and it's secreting its oil right into the hair follicle. And right next to it, this is an arrector pili muscle. Remember, when this muscle contracts, it's going to cause the hair to straighten and stand erect. It's what we refer to as goosebumps. Here's another artist's drawing of the integument with the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous tissue, below it. You can see these accessory structures. Here's a hair follicle with a hair growing out of it. Here's the papilla down at the bottom. The enlarged area is called the bulb. Here's the hair shaft. And there would be inner and outer sheaths around this follicle. Here's a sebaceous gland. There's no apocrine sweat gland in this drawing, but there is an eccrine sweat gland in this drawing, secreting right up to the surface of the skin. The epidermis here would be everything from this layer right here upwards. So all of this tightly packed cellular material upwards is epidermis. This from here to here is dermis in the lighter pink color. Remember, there's a papillary layer up top and a reticular layer on the bottom. Right where the blood vessels lie down here, that's the bottom of the reticular layer. That's the end of the integument. That's the bottom of the skin. Below that is the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous tissue, and they're showing us that it's loaded with adipose. It's loaded with fat. Notice that there's lots of blood supply up into the papillary layer of the dermis. Remember, because this epithelial tissue in the epidermis is avascular, we need blood supply in the upper layer of the dermis. Over here, this last structure right here, this represents arrector pili muscle that's capable of contracting and straightening out the hair. Let's look at some images under the light microscope. In this image, you can see this strange looking sort of coiled structure. This is an eccrine sweat gland. If you follow the dark purple duct upwards through the dermis and into the epidermis, it's going to release sweat out to the surface of the skin. Over on the right hand side, I want you to look at this structure right here. This is a hair follicle with a hair growing out of it. So the papillae would be down at the bottom. This whole region would be called the bulb. There's an inner and an outer sheath here. There's the hair shaft growing right out of it. This structure right here This is a sebaceous gland. It's secreting an oily substance right into the hair follicle. Over here you can see coils of another gland. This is a sweat gland. I can't see where the duct is going here. If the duct was heading into the hair follicle, I would call it an apocrine sweat gland. If the duct was heading up to the surface of the skin, I would call it an eccrine sweat gland. So we've now discussed all of the functions of the integument. We've looked at the epidermis and the dermis and all of the layers involved. Now let's take a minute and think about how the skin heals itself, how it becomes repaired after it's injured. And by injured, I'm referring to just a laceration or a cut. What we're talking about in wound repair is a series of 4 steps. And I have those steps numbered on this slide. And I have the name of each step in this uppercase, bold-faced red type. So when you receive a laceration or a cut through the integument, obviously part of what's going to get injured are the blood vessels that are lying in the dermis, and those cut blood vessels are going to bleed. They're going to bleed directly into that wounded area. And that bleeding process, that hemorrhage process, is going to trigger a clotting mechanism, what we refer to as the clotting cascade or the coagulation cascade. This bleeding is important. It's going to be an important part of wound healing. So this is our first step in the process. We refer to this as hemostasis. And if you translate that word, it just means blood and stopping. So the blood is going to clot inside the wound. That blood clot is going to actually fill in that wound. And I said a minute ago that this is actually really important because that blood clot is going to do some work for us. It's going to help prevent things like bacteria and viruses and other pathogens from getting into that broken skin. Remember, part of the function of the integument is to protect against pathogens. So when the integument is broken or lacerated, there has to be a way to help keep pathogens out before it heals up. And that blood clot is going to do some of that work. Now the blood clot will contract down and it will dry out. It's the blood clot that eventually produces what we think of as the scab on a wound. Hemostasis, step 1. The second thing that happens is the process of inflammation. And we'll talk about inflammation in just a minute. The third step that happens is a process called proliferation. Now, what this word is referring to is the production of new cells to help close up that wound. But those new cells are not the only cells that are involved in this phase. What happens during proliferation is several types of immune cells are going to come into the area, particularly a cell called a macrophage. Remember, if you translate macrophage, it means big eater. These are immune cells that are going to help remove that clotted blood. There's another kind of cell called the fibroblast. Remember, we talked about those when we discussed connective tissue. Fibroblasts are going to come in and start replacing the lost collagen fibers so that, again, the wound can begin healing. The cut blood vessels are going to begin to regenerate, and the epithelial cells are going to start dividing to replace the cells that are gone. epithelial cell division and regeneration begins at the edges of the wound. And actually, the new cells travel over the surface of the wound and then work their way down, filling the wound internally. This brand new tissue that is forming gets a name. We call this granulation tissue. Granulation tissue is its own special form of connective tissue. Eventually, we need new skin here. We need new integument. But right now, in these beginning stages of healing, this granulation tissue will come in instead. It's a very vascular type of tissue. It has a very distinct appearance. It's very pink. You've probably seen it in your own wounds as they've been healing. The last stage is called remodeling, and this is where the granulation tissue is going to be replaced. This is where the granulation tissue, that very vascular connective tissue, will be replaced with the normal epidermis and dermis of the integument. If the laceration is large enough and the extent of it, the depth of it, is great enough, you may end up with scar tissue formation in the wound. That's a process that we refer to as fibrosis. But in most minor wounds, the granulation tissue will be progressively replaced with new integument. That's the stage that we call remodeling. So there are 4 distinct stages to wound healing. There's stage 1, hemostasis. That's when the blood that fills up the wound begins to clot, and that clot starts to contract down. Stage 2 is inflammation. Stage 3 is proliferation, and stage 4 is remodeling. You can see in the drawing the layers of the integument. You can see epidermis at the top in the darker color, dermis underneath in the lighter color, and then below the integument you can see the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous tissue. So this is a wound that came down all the way through the integument and into the subcutaneous tissue. That's about the limit that of the depth of a laceration that can be completely repaired. I want to take just a minute and talk about the second stage of wound healing, which is inflammation. There are 4 key clinical signs that you should be familiar with regards to inflammation. The area of inflammation is going to swell. It's going to turn a reddish color. It's going to be warm to the touch, and it's going to hurt. Those are the 4 hallmarks of inflamed tissue. Now, on this slide, we're looking at sort of the stages of inflammation. I don't want you to worry about this too much, but I do want you to understand that during inflammation, there's a lot of fluid release from the blood vessels in the area. Now, I'm not talking about the blood vessels that get broken in the laceration. I'm talking about the surrounding blood vessels. What happens is they become very leaky in response to the injury, and cells and fluids that are inside the intact blood vessels are going to start to leak out. This is what causes the swelling of the inflamed tissue. Then I also want us to be familiar with the idea that some of the cells that are coming out of those leaky blood vessels are immune cells. There are different kinds of immune cells. You can see some names here, neutrophils and macrophages. Don't worry about that too much, but understand that these cells are releasing a whole lot of chemicals, and it's the chemicals that are causing that tissue to be hot and red and painful. In other words, the pain and the redness and the warmth around a wound, that is an indication that the immune system is doing the job that it needs to do to help heal that injury. So, for inflammation, think about swelling, redness, heat, and pain. Now, while we're talking about blood vessels and leaky blood vessels, I want to go back to our earlier discussion of some of the things that can impact skin color. If you recall, we said that melanin is the primary pigment in human skin, but beta carotene can also be stored in human skin and impart sort of a yellowish orange color. The other material that contributes to the color of our skin is the hemoglobin that's present in our blood. Remember, hemoglobin is the molecule, the protein that's in your red blood cells that helps carry gases to and from your tissues. So it brings oxygen to your tissues and it carries carbon dioxide away from your tissues. As blood circulates through your lungs, the gases are exchanged. The carbon dioxide is released from hemoglobin. The oxygen is loaded up onto hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is an enormous protein. It has 4 individual subunits, what are called 2 alpha type and 2 beta type. And each one of those subunits in that protein has a very particular type of molecule called a heme group in it. And that heme group is associated with iron. That's why if you're anemic, if you are low in the number of blood cells that are circulating, you're also typically low in your iron levels. Now, when hemoglobin becomes bound to oxygen, it turns a distinctive red color. When hemoglobin is bound to carbon dioxide, it is a much darker color. It's more of a dark red or almost bluish color. So the capillaries that are located in the integument, remember particularly in the dermis of the integument, because they are full of hemoglobin in the red blood cells, they're going to contribute somewhat to the color of our skin. People who have very fair skin, who don't have very much melanin in their skin, in other words, sometimes those lighter skinned people get a very rosy look in the areas where the capillaries are very close to the surface of the skin. We can also see the effect of hemoglobin in a very important medical condition referred to as cyanosis. Any time that the oxygen saturation level in the bloodstream is too low, what'll happen is you'll be less saturated on the hemoglobin with oxygen, and that's going to mean that reduced form of hemoglobin will be present. That dark bluish form of hemoglobin will be more abundant in the blood. That bluish tinge can be seen in the skin. This is what we call cyanosis, and it occurs at an oxygen saturation level of about 85%. Normally, we would want anywhere from 95 to 100% oxygen saturation in the blood. So, when oxygen saturation levels get low, you have the more reduced form of hemoglobin in the blood, the bluish form in the blood, and you start to see it in capillary-rich regions, the fingertips, the toes, the lips, the tongue, the edges of the mouth, the nail beds, and so on. Take a look at these pictures and you can see cyanosis. If you look over here on the right, you can see this strange bluish color in the fingertips of this person. This is a person whose oxygen saturation levels are too low. This woman up top, you can see she has a very distinctive bluish tinge to her lips and her tongue. This woman down on the bottom left of the slide has a very distinct bluish tinge to her lips. And this little baby, oh, up at the top, this little baby has a bluish tinge all around his mouth and nose, oh, up around his eyes. It's hard for me to even look at this picture. This little baby is in trouble. This little baby does not have enough oxygen in his blood. That's cyanosis.